I just had to hit the record button because I already would forgotten it, moving into a different mode. Hey, welcome to the Night School Series 16. As you know, in the Series 16, well, any night school, I'm trying to take things that I notice people thinking about, talking about, dealing with, and try to draw from our distinguished past as humans on this planet the finest and most insightful voices available and try to bring them forward in the night school one by one, each as a guest, to speak to us. The idea is to be open as God is open and to look for the gifts of God and for help, not just in the expected religious channels. Rick, you're a priest, you should be, blah, blah, blah. But wherever goodness is found, wherever the truth was sincerely dealt with and lived within, that is always a place of learning for us, and it will only increase our capacity to richly receive what Christ has given us, what God has given us, the Trinity, in the Old Testament story and the New Testament story, and then in the lives of the saints. So I'd like to talk about a man who was a contemporary of Jesus, who lived at the very highest levels within the Roman Empire that dominated the world of Jesus. They were the overpower. And this was a man who was his contemporary, who was born with his family in Spain. So he was an outlier. He wasn't from Italy itself, where the prestige elites came from. His family came from the provinces. But Spain, as well as Egypt, were distinguished provinces, and it wasn't too far a step down to acknowledge that you were from Spain, like they were. But at an early age, he was brought to Rome and educated there and lived pretty much in obscurity, almost exactly like Jesus did, and for most exactly about as long. He was about 30 years old, like we think Jesus was about 30 years old, when he kind of burst into public view through the help of a powerful aunt of his who opened doors for him. Seneca lived from 4 before Christ, which some scholars think is about the date Christ was born, probably about 4 BC, given evidences we have in the scriptural text, rather than in the year 0. So Christ was born before Christ. I guess he's God. He can do whatever he wants. But 4 BC. And he lived to about 65 after Christ, which is about the time Paul lived and died, St. Paul. So you kind of frame him there. Um, I'd like to just answer this question because someone asked me this recently is why should we spend time trying to learn from pagan authors? Well, one of the reasons is that the Christian church itself listened deeply to the great ones of the pagan tradition and learned from them. They went to school on Seneca's Latin style, on Cicero's Latin style, their enormous capacity to express themselves beautifully in language. Christians learned from them. Someone like St. Augustine, the great Augustine, longed to be as good at expression as some of these ancient thinkers were. So to call them pagan is suggestive of them not worth our time as a mistake because our very church revered them. Another reason is that to read the ancient ones, to look for greatness wherever it is part of this famous thing called a liberal education. And does not mean liberal in contrast to conservative. Liberal means freeing. the ability of an education to set a person free, to think for themselves, to be easily conversant, not just in one's clique, one's preferred or chosen meaning system, but the freedom and the responsibility to move outside those circles for the sake of gaining a capacity to understand people very different than we are. Not be afraid of that, to actually seek capacity to have a more universal knowledge. So that's one of the reasons we look for the great ones in these pagan authors and why we have three of them in Series 16 of the Night School. The last one, next time, John Cashin, is a profound Christian thinker who comes from the desert tradition of early Christianity. Um, I'd like to begin by reading to you a short letter. So, Seneca lived a very complicated life, and I'll get to that in a minute. But I first want to go right to his voice. At the end of his life, after a calamitous and difficult life, working at the highest levels of the Roman Empire as it was getting underway, um, at the end of his life in his retirement, he wrote a series of 50 letters to a friend named Lucilius that he chose writing of letters to communicate some of the deepest things he has learned from his consequential life is very instructive. He could write essays, but he wrote many letters and poured his wisdom in a conversational style with a friend of his named Lucilius. So listen just to this short letter that he's writing to his friend about the importance of reading not just anything, but being selective about the authors you read and being willing to reread, read and reread again the great authors instead of always looking for something new to read. Okay, just listen to his voice. I'm just going to let you hear his voice in this letter, and then I'm just going to ask you to react to it. What did you hear when I read it to you? Okay? I won't read every line of it, but most of it. So he's going to talk about thrashing around. What he means is having a mind undisciplined that is jumping from thought to thought, always racing around for the new sparkly idea, and not calm enough to stay with something and sink into it. Okay. Quote, thrashing around in that way indicates a mind in poor health. In my view, the first sign of a settled mind is that it can stay in one place and spend time with itself. Be careful, though, about your reading in many authors and every type of book. It may be that there is something wayward and unstable in this habit. You must stay with a limited number of writers and be fed by them if you mean to derive anything that will dwell reliably with you. One who is everywhere is nowhere. Those who travel all the time find that they have many places to stay, but no friendships. The same thing necessarily happens to those who do not become intimate with any one author, but let everything rush right through them. So, since you cannot read everything that you have, it is sufficient to have only the amount you can read. I just want you to hear his voice. Okay, almost done here. But I want to read different books at different times, you say. Well, the person of delicate digestion nibbles at this and that. And when the diet is too varied, though, food does not nourish, but only upsets the stomach. So read always from authors of proven worth. And if ever you are inclined to turn aside to others, return afterwards to the previous ones. That's kind of his voice. He writes 50 letters that have these titles. And then I'm going to ask you, what did you hear when you heard that? So, but I want to give you an example of some of the titles of these 50 letters. So you get a sense of how the philosophy he's talking about, that Cicero was talking about, is not an abstract subject to be studied in school. The true philosophy is the ability to live a reflective life, to find wisdom in your own experience, to actually think about your day. So I was mentioning that next Tuesday we're in Holy Week. Well, one of the things, if I ever, am speaking in a Holy Week context, that I'll ask people is, what do you know more this year about the meaning of Holy Week, the passion, death, and resurrection of Christ? What do you know this year than you did last year? Because you've lived a whole year of experiences, met new people, went through good health, bad health, whatever. What do you know more now this year than you did last year? This is to live a philosophical life. It only indirectly and not necessarily means reading philosophy books. It means thinking deeply about what you actually experience and wondering what it means or what name you would give to an experience you had today. What would be the right name for what just happened at 1 o'clock this afternoon? So you hear this in the titles of these letters, and I'll just read you a few of the titles. First letter, and then I'll just go straight through to 14. Taking charge of your time. Number 2, which I've just read from, a beneficial reading program. 3, trusting one's friends. Next, intimacy within friendship. Next, avoiding the crowd. Next, writing as a form of service. Next, friendship and self-sufficiency. Next, very interestingly, on blushing. Why do I blush? What is that exactly? It's a very physical reaction to an interior experience. What is that connection? And why should it access the blood in such a way that it sends it to my face? I don't blush in my fingers or my toes. Why the face? Do you get an idea of the philosophical life? Not letting things just slip by, but selecting from each day something of significance and then thinking into it. Next, visiting a childhood home. Finally, there are many more, but I'm just going to stop. Safety in a dangerous world. These are beautifully well-crafted letters written by Seneca at the end of his life to his friend Lucilius. So you, having heard the letter number 2 to Lucilius on read proven authors. ones that are truly worth it, that make demands on you, and that not only require but invite you to read and reread and then reread again. If you remember, C.S. Lewis said his definition of a good reader is not a person who's read a lot of books, but a person who's read and reread good books. Any comments on that letter? Anything that struck you? And if you want to say something, just unmute yourself so we can hear you speak.
Um, I just am struck by how practical it is, right?
Much
And
so.
yeah, practical. And also I'm laughing because I don't do that. I'm thinking about how many books I have stacked beside my bed and on my kitchen table and in the bookcase that are ready for me to read, and how many are waiting at the library for me. And I'm indiscriminate and kind of greedy in my reading, right?
Yeah,
And I think, okay, well, maybe there's some wisdom there. I need to slow down a bit and think more.
that's a wonderful thought, Maureen, and I bet shared by many people.
Hmm.
Um, what he's saying, as you heard him say, your word is indiscriminate. And at the core of that is the spiritual gift of discernment. The word discernment comes from the same root. And it means to open a book is to invite a set of thoughts into you. That is a profound thing to let someone else's thoughts into you because they will have their effect. And so to be discriminating, it's what we used to call, and now it's very, oh, can't do that, to the canon of great books. People say, well, you leave out other good books. That is true. Often our canon of good books was highly Anglo-Saxon or Western. It didn't include the great books of other cultures. Yes, guilty as charged. And so we need to open the canon broader. But the world has recognized that great books are less rather than more. And great books, to tangle with them and to fall in love with them, is a profound experience, much more important than just reading a lot of books. So, Maureen, thank you for offering that insight. Bet many could resonate with it.
I sure could. I was just thinking of Saint Therese de Lisieux at the end of her life. I think I remember her reading. I was struck by what I read that she all her books. She had lots of books, but she said nothing had any taste for her anymore. Just the scripture.
Right.
That struck me.
Yeah. Yeah.
I feel I've been indicted, uh, somewhat like Maureen. I read for pleasure, for distraction. I read like a whale eats zooplankton. I'm gulping down krill as fast as I can. Suddenly, I'm confronted by the fact that it's not krill. It needs to be a few things deeply engaged with, almost memorized in portions. And it's just not the way of the world. It's not the way I digest. So I feel as if I've been indicted, and I'll have to go away and think about this and maybe leave some zooplankton for someone else to read.
Well, Stephen, you just perfectly captured some of the finest results of any night school is not the chance to be indicted, but to be awakened to certain insights, something you might have not seen that the wise ones of our past have a beautiful way of inviting us to consider. I mean, my gosh. So the invitation is there. And um, I just remember this simple example of um, for a long time, to be a Christian thinker, philosopher, and theologian in the Western church, all of the Western church, everyone had to cut their teeth on St. Thomas Aquinas. He was a comprehensive thinker who thought everything with incredible, magnificent depth and putting it in relation to everything else. Just one of the most astonishing performances of a mind that has ever existed. And every educated Christian who wanted to know something about theology or philosophy had to go through Aquinas and tangle with him. He was the one author that you kept returning to. Even as you read other stuff, you'd come back to the great one and read again and again. It's a different way of learning than the consumer society we live in, which next, 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 next. You see, it's a different way. Thank you for your comments. One of the critiques of Seneca, let me just offer it to you. He wrote in a very practical way, as Maureen, you said, just those titles, because philosophy again is a reflective life. That famous line from Socrates, an unexamined life is not worth living. That's what we're talking about here. That Seneca wrote so beautifully of a very high-minded life. And yet, the example of his life was a constant conflict with his high-mindedness. He spoke eloquently and often about simplicity of life. And yet he was arguably, possibly, the single wealthiest person in the entire Roman Empire, even more wealthy than the emperor himself. Huh. He was often in danger because of his enormous wealth and what came with it. People said, gosh, you talk a nice game, but your life just isn't consistent. Ah. So my question to you, because it's a good one to ask any of us, is it worth trying to learn from a hypocrite? I'm putting this dramatically. Is it worth trying to learn from a hypocrite? My answer is absolutely yes. And an example would be Jesus himself. Think of him. When he talked about the Pharisees and the scribes that worked together and the kind of self-satisfied religion that they practiced, loading burdens on those who weren't nearly as smart or cool as they were. I'm just saying that it's true of any in-group. I'm not slamming them in particular. That kind of attitude is everywhere in the human family, always. But Jesus said in Matthew 23, then addressing the crowds and his disciples, Jesus said, the scribes and the Pharisees occupy the chair of Moses. In other words, they really do know the scripture. They really do, inside and out. You must therefore do and observe what they tell you. They do know the content, and it's high and important, and it's of God. But do not be guided by what they do, since they do not practice what they preach. Do you see what Jesus did there? If there is truth and wisdom and high-mindedness, listen to it, learn from it, receive it for the gift it is, but overlook the inconsistency of the teacher. It's best when they align. It's very beautiful and powerful when the teaching perfectly aligns with the life. But honestly, that doesn't happen very often with us humans. It just doesn't. Even the greatest. Listen to this one from Romans 7, St. Paul himself. So I find this rule that for me, where I want to do nothing but good, evil is close at hand. In my inmost self, I dearly love God's law. But I see that acting on my body, there is a different law which battles against the law in my mind. So I am brought to be a prisoner of that law of sin, which lives inside my body. What a wretched man I am. Who will rescue me from this body doomed to death? God, thanks be to him through Jesus Christ our Lord. So it is true that I myself with my mind obey the law of God, but in my disordered nature, I obey the law of sin. He's a hypocrite. One of our greatest, most holy teachers ever. I'm not praising hypocrisy. What I'm praising is our ability to see humans and cut them some slack, that often we aren't consistent. And it's wrong of us to ignore the gift they give because we notice they aren't perfectly consistent with the gift. Carol, did you have a thought?
Well, I did. I mean, I think this is all really interesting, and it kind of makes me think of Walt Whitman saying, "Do I contradict myself? Very well, then. I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes." And maybe if we were more curious about other people, we would think they probably contain things we don't easily see. And contradictions might actually be a reflection of how much complexity there is in a person. I'm
You,
just,
my goodness, Carol, what a beautiful, articulate statement. Thank you.
that's Whitman, not me. But I mean, it's a
No,
wonderful
you
statement.
you clearly thought about it and absorbed it and said that beautifully. Yes, in the contradictions that we find in ourselves, God, Seneca must have suffered so much because he did see a beautiful and high-minded life. It was so clear to him what that should be. And yet he lived a life that didn't match that. And when you experience it, I do all the time. I'm not even close, you know. But I used to be just terribly preoccupied and it was painful. It's still painful, but I'm not so much preoccupied anymore because I know that God understands me better than I do. And I honestly don't make sense even to myself. But when I'm able to give whatever gifts I have to other people, it's the only time I kind of make sense. So somehow my own inner, you know, complexity, what God does with that is something that amazes me. And maybe that's the way it is for you too. And I think it's why Seneca could write with such passion about the life he longed for because he could never get there. That was important. I should mention one last thing that in St. Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits, someone with whom I've spent a lot of time, that he was asked once, what? So when you think of Jesuits and we're founders of schools, one of the greatest founders of schools and educational systems, we've done so many things through the history of, through the centuries. I'm not boasting, I'm describing. What do you think he would say is the single most important requirement for a true leader after the heart of Ignatius's vision of a Jesuit leader? What was the single most important quality he looked for in a man? And he wrote the answer very clearly. He said the single most important requirement for a true leader is for him to have great desires. Not an MBA, not capacity, not degrees, academic degrees or credentials, not proven. No, a man of great desires. So, by definition, what that means is a man who's always beyond himself in the longing he hopes for. In other words, in my understanding of it, a great leader will be someone who always feels the humiliation, if you will, but from humiliation comes humility of longing for great things for his people and himself never getting there, but wanting to get there and bring others to it. I think a great leader in this, the way we're talking about it, and someone like Seneca, you have to have an enormous capacity for embarrassment, kind of. Enormous capacity for inconstancy in a certain way that you don't match up to the ideal. But a person of great longing can bring a people a long way if those longings are for the true and beautiful things. Next step, I'd like to ask you something that haunted Seneca his whole life, and then let you kind of learn something about him. I'd like to ask you to consider, do you have any idea what you mean? So I say this to myself too. Do you have any idea what you mean when you decide what it means that you are successful? What exactly is a successful person? My goodness, this is a word that's out there all the time. And if it's not explicitly there, it's there. Are you successful or not? And it's not considered a compliment for someone to say you're not a successful person. In the spirit of a philosophy that reflects on what you're actually experiencing and thinks into it, why would you or I be embarrassed or angry if someone spoke of us as unsuccessful? What's going on there? What does success mean? Because if we look at Jesus, the founder of our faith, he sits in all our churches at a spectacular example of an unsuccessful life. Crucified, humiliated, stripped naked, and beaten to death as people look on. And yet he is the very model of a successful life. We do not think deeply enough about what that means. And because we don't, we get afflicted. I hear it in very talented people who kind of cut into themselves, even in their very accomplished life. They cut into themselves about their lack of success in some way. It shows that there's a haunting around this word and the idea. And people don't really know what they mean, though they think they do. And when you ask them who a successful person is, how often do you consider that maybe they miss something when they point to that person or that point as successful? The reason I ask this is this is a central dynamic in almost all of Seneca's writings that I've read. He lived in a very complicated world. He lived in the age of the opening of the Roman Empire in the Julio Claudian line of emperors. My goodness, were they a complicated group. Starting with Julius Caesar, who was murdered, and then his adopted son Octavian, who won the emperorship by beating Mark Antony and Pompey, General Pompey, uh, to take over the emperorship. So he was the successor. Then there was Tiberius. Then there was Caligula. Then there was Claudius. Then there was Nero. My God, almost all of them were pathologically dangerous men. Not all the time, but got there, corrupted by absolute power and wealth and honors and flattery. Just wreck them. And Seneca grew up in that kind of culture. What would a successful life mean? He was surrounded by people in a certain way who had all the marks of success. They were the elite class, they were the patricians. They got to wear the toga, the white toga. And if they were really up there, they got to put purple on it. And my God, if you were emperor, you couldn't go higher than that. Isn't that success? And yet Seneca was reflective enough. Remember, philosophy is reflecting on the life you're actually living and wondering about it, making up your own mind. He looked at those who had everything and saw the absolute wreckage of their lives. What in the world does success mean? Really good question. And I offer it to you to wonder about yourself because I believe we're haunted by it. I hear all versions of it all the time. Starts in high school and middle school. Am I in the right group? Do I look right? Am I smart enough? All these images of what successful life is. So, the first observation I would make that someone like Seneca invites us to consider is what if we withdrew the meaning of success from what the crowd says? He has a letter on stay away from crowds because you fall under the power of groupthink. And no matter how strong you are, it will bend you in ways that you can't resist. What if we removed success from what the crowd says, what that group says it is, wants you to make sure you understand that that's what they are? What if you pulled it completely out of that context and considered what success is a deeply reflective life in which you decide for yourself today through teaching and what you've learned from other people, what you've read, what you're reading. How did you do today at being a good person, an awake person, a thoughtful one who can say without question today, I definitely gave my gifts freely. to this person and that person. Let me give an example, another example, a very concrete one from my own life. And then I'll ask you to tell me and us, what do you think about this thought about what a successful life is? I'll just ask a couple of you to comment before we listen to him. All of us have times in our life that hunt us down. It's what we have in the Lord's Prayer. We say, and lead us not into temptation and deliver us from evil. Or in another reading of it in one of the other gospels, but do not put us to the test. It means that ultimate test, the thing that really is so difficult. And I remember I went through a time like that. Have walked with people through that time many times, different people. And I knew someday it would be my turn, and I had my turn, and it was hard and scary and difficult. And I remembered that as I labored and just buried myself in the scriptures every day and just searched for God in my experience, I remember I'd come to the end of the day and wonder whether I had a good day or not. And I came to this conclusion, and I found it so helpful to me. If I consider the successful day one that depends on what my feelings are doing, I have no way of arriving at a good conclusion about any particular day because feelings go up and down for reasons that are reasonable and ones that are unreasonable. They just are quicksilver, up and down. Instead, I was able to say, I have really good habits. And if I practiced those habits today, those combination of 5 or 6 things I always do, then if I did those habits, then by definition, I had a good day. Even if my feelings made me feel like had a horrible day, I'd say, I'm not going to listen to those. I did those habits and I did them the best I could. That's a good day. Thinking like this about what success actually is what Seneca, by his own example and writing, wants to teach us to do also. Okay? Any thoughts on this?
I have a couple of just kind of stray thoughts on it. One thing that I've noticed over the years when people are having one of those milestone birthdays, the ones that are really upset by them are ones that are not where they thought they would be when they were that age. So that kind of ties in with their success thing. As far as success, also, I think that ties into being comfortable in your own skin. But sometimes that's a little too comfortable. So there is that. That's only a partial thing. But as far as a good day, today actually, a friend of mine who lost her husband, and is planning the funeral and going through Lent, and she's going to a new church, and they're going through a Lenten meditations, and the sermon on Sunday was about Lazarus, and she was really confused as to why Jesus cried. Why was he crying? If he, what did he know? Did he know what the Father wanted him, what the plan was? Or was he just really in tune with his Father? And so at least I got her thinking when I said, well, Jesus was fully human and fully divine. So he felt everything that we humans feel. And that's why he would cry, whether he was crying for Lazarus or for himself or for Mary and Martha. He felt everything that we feel. And we'll never, I mean, we don't know what he knew. We don't know how much he knew about God's plan, but he still prayed and he still, so I think that was a day where somebody actually came to me for wisdom. And that's humbling.
It is humbling. And thank you for sharing that. And I bet one of the things you noticed is to be present to someone and to try to really listen into their life and offer something that might help or something that helps them not feel alone, but it doesn't feel like, gosh, I was a success. What it feels like is that it was a good day. And maybe that's just a lot more important than having a successful life is having a good one, being good every day. Let me give an example of this from Seneca. And I'll quote from Emily Wilson, who's one of the great living scholars of Seneca right now, right in the prime of her life, the first woman ever in the history that we know of, history of the world, to ever translate Homer's Odyssey from Greek into English. That had always been the preserve of men. She's the first one who did it. Did a beautiful job. I read it and thought it was a beautiful job. Anyway, she writes this. Seneca insists that those who attempt to conquer the world and attain political, military, and economic power are far inferior to those who manage to achieve the empire of control over themselves. Imperare sibi maximum imperium est. To be an emperor of oneself is the greatest empire. Do you hear the shift about what success might mean or what it would look like? And Seneca caught right between two imperiums, to use the Latin word, two controlling powers, the world of the emperor and the whole thing around the political structure, and the world of a truly free and good person who has self-knowledge and is able to control himself or herself. Seneca's intellectual activities as a writer and a philosopher allowed him to grasp toward an alternative to the life of politics and ambition, creating his own distinct model of what real power should look like. Beautiful, right? If you don't like it, I don't like you. So there. Ha. So let me give you an example of the voice of Seneca talking about an important term for him, which is magnanimity. My goodness, if you understand, it means great soul, having a great soul. Magnanimity is almost everything opposite to what you or I can see in any political theater that we've walked in. Magnanimity is needed. Listen to something he says. You can recognize a mind that is sound if it is content and confident, if it knows that all human desires, all favors granted and sought, have no bearing on the best human life. Whatever can be increased is imperfect. Whatever can be lessened is impermanent. A mind that will know unending happiness should rejoice in its own resources. He's saying, as Jesus said in another context, the kingdom of God is within you. In the world of Seneca, who didn't know Jesus, he's saying, we have all we need within us. We have been given powers and capacities. Our problem is we don't know what they are. We don't train what we've been given. We go around longing. I wish I had this gift. I wish I had his gift. I wish I had her gift. I wish I had their gift. And we never come home to the ones we actually have. They're more than sufficient, is what he means by this comment. There is magnanimity built into every person, but you have to reach for it and train it. He goes on. Yet even fortune's gifts are pleasing when reason has blended and balanced them. It is reason that makes these gifts agreeable, while the greedy get no satisfaction from them. And then he quotes one of his most important mentors, one of his two most important ones, a man by the name of Attalus. Attalus used this metaphor. Have you ever seen a dog, jaws wide open, trying to snatch a bit of bread or meat its master has tossed? Whatever it gets, it immediately swallows whole and is always gaping, hopefully, for more. Have you seen that with dogs? I mean, you could give them a T-bone, the finest steak from the ringside, and they would go, hum, and it'd just be gone. You just swallow it. We're the same way. Whatever fortune tosses us as we wait, we immediately swallow down without savoring it, frantically intent on snatching more. This does not happen to the wise. Whatever comes along, they calmly take up and set aside, enjoying a happiness that is very great, unending, a happiness all their own. Get the voice? St. Ignatius would say at one point, it's not knowing much that counts, but it's knowing what one truly knows and savoring it. That's what satisfies the soul. Here's another thing that he says to get his voice as we getting close to the end here. He says, Epicurus wrote this noble thought to Idomeneus, urging him to make Pythocles rich in no common or ambiguous way. Quote, if you want to make Pythocles wealthy, don't increase his funds, lessen his desires. Isn't that great? At another point in a letter, I think it's in letter number 2, Seneca would say, the poor man is not the one who has less than the rich one. The poor man is one who is always craving for more. Isn't that an interesting insight? It's a similar thing to what I said about we already have what we need. So much has been given us. We just don't know what we have. We always want more. It's just worth noticing. And when we think of the Ten Commandments, remember if you were to draw a line in the air, and on this end, I've used this image before, at this end, where commandment number one is, it's all God. I am God and you aren't. I am God. You have to start there. That's the way in. Do you get that? And it's not just an act of thought, it's a transformation of perspective from being at the center of one's world to God being at the center of the world, of every world. At this end, it's all God. At commandments 9 and 10, it's all me. Covet, 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 covet. Crave, 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 crave. Never satisfied. More, more, more. Not enough, not enough. You get it? So his wisdom here is instead of to make a person wealthy, instead of giving them more, teach them to desire less. Teach them to desire things that will truly bless them instead of desires that will drain them. He goes on, and this will be my last point, and then we'll stop. The point is too clear to need interpreting and too neat to need embellishing. One thing I do urge. Don't suppose that this saying applies only to wealth. Change the frame of reference. Its force stays the same. If you want to make Pythocles honorable, don't increase his honors. Excessive flattery. God, you're great. Here, have an award. No, lessen his desires for that. If you want Pythocles to enjoy unending pleasure, don't increase his pleasures. Lessen his desires for them. If you want Pythocles to reach old age, living a full life, don't add to his years, lessen his desires. These thoughts, so wise, you'll find in some of the greatest, most profound Christian mystical literature. Certainly John of the Cross in the Ascent of Mount Carmel. This theme around desires and lessening desires is a central thing. The reason I mention it, the reason we read beyond our favorite frame of reference, reaching into the ancient ones, is that they were on to things too, because God dwelt in them also. And we should gain a taste and a capacity to look for grace wherever it is, because it helps us lay claim to the rich gift we've been given in Christ and our faith. It helps us understand the gift better. Let me pause. I'd like to finish with this consideration taken from the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius as a final and closing prayer. And in it, you hear a lot of the basic instincts, what Seneca, never having known the God of the Old Testament, nor Jesus Christ, who was his contemporary, hadn't heard of him. Certainly, there was no New Testament during the time he lived. That came later. It sounds like this, our closing thought. The goal of our life is to live with God forever. God who loves us, gave us life. Our own response of love allows God's life to flow into us without limit. Let him do what he wants to do. All the things in this world are gifts from God, presented to us so that we can know God more easily and make a return of love more readily. As a result, we appreciate and use all these gifts of God insofar as they help us to develop as loving persons. But if any of these gifts become the center of our lives, they displace God and so hinder our growth toward our goal. In everyday life, then, we must hold ourselves in balance before all these created gifts, insofar as we have a choice and are not bound by some obligation. We should not fix our desires on health or sickness, wealth or poverty, success or failure, a long life or a short life. For everything has the potential of calling forth in us a deeper response to our life in God. And the last line, our only desire and our one choice should be this: I want and I choose what better leads to God's deepening his life in me. Amen. Well, thank you all. So nice to have you here. Unmute yourself so you can say goodbye to everybody. It's whenever I look at you in this way in your rectangles, I think of do you remember Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In? And they had this wall, and people would peek out, Goldie Hawn and others, they'd pop out through these different windows and stuff. That's what it seems like. But anyway, I enjoyed being able to share something of this wise man, a contemporary of Jesus who lived in the Roman period, and I'll be sure to send you some of my follow-up notes if you wish to pursue.
Yes.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thanks. It's nice to see you all. Mariette, blessings on Canada. When you take us over, thank you for sharing with us your
Are there
national
other
anthem.
Canadians? Are there other Canadians here? I'm speaking. Yeah, me too. Yeah.
Oh, you're also one of those. Oh my,
Yes.
we're about
And
ready to take over
thinking
your
how
library.
timely these lessons are right now for where everything is.
Isn't
And
it true, Carol? Yes.
yeah, yeah.
Because it was the world that Seneca lived in a deeply, there was much that was similar. The destruction of a republic in the emergence of an imperium.
Well, I was thinking about his letter on safety in a dangerous world, and
Yeah.
thinking how apt that might be right now. Uh, he
Yeah,
was living in that, and yeah, it's there's all these things are being challenged right now,
they are.
and
Yes.
uh, we
Yeah,
just we try to be able to rise up and be the best we can with another definition of success.
absolutely. It's another definition of it. That's right. Yeah. I was talking with a directee just the other day about the significance of glorious failure. I said, this is an important spiritual category for us Christians, especially when they're so motivated like he was to try to be good, try to get it right. And I said, it has become an idol for you. We have to remember that at the center of our faith is a glorious failure. It completely overturned what we think success is. Anyway, it was nice to hear your voice, Carol, and save me a piece of land up there when I come up there to take over your country. Okay, Carol. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, Barry and Katie, so nice to
Bye-bye.
Bye.
good night now. Have a good dinner now. See you, Mariette.
Bye.
Look after that beautiful country of yours.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. And good night, Jennifer, with one N. I hope you've had a good dinner of steak perfectly cooked in a baked potato with fresh Kerrygold butter in it. Yeah, sounds good. Okay, I will quit recording.